How are you, everyone? Okay, I think we've started to reach critical mass, so we can go ahead and start. I'll start us off with one ohm. Oh. How are you, everyone? Welcome to our April Wellness Workshop. My name is Rishi. I'm from the Mentorship Sangha. Really excited to see all of you. I know it's been a while. In March, we had our Mentorship Sangha retreat, which went incredibly well. It was super meaningful, and I know a number of you that are on this call today were there. So excited to see you all again. We have a very special guest and speaker for this wellness workshop. Vignesh has gracefully granted us some more of his time that was already so powerful in the first retreat. And so for those during our retreat in March. And so for those of you who have not met Vignesh or were unfortunately unable to attend our retreat in March, I'll go ahead and provide an introduction, and then I'll go ahead and turn it over to him. So Vignesh is a spiritual seeker who has been guided by Vigji since he was actually in high school. And he's seen the purpose of his life as to see and serve God in himself and in all beings. And a form that this has taken is in his professional service, which is in mental health care. So Vignesh is a residential psychiatrist at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and he focuses on providing mental health care to marginalized families. And throughout this work, the intersection between spirituality and mental health has become a central theme and really started to manifest. And so I won't steal all the thunder from Vignesh, but during the retreat, he really highlighted how to define mental health and really made it very applicable and accessible for all of us. And so with that, Vignesh, gratitude for you and your time, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. Hariom.
Hariom, everyone. You can hear me and see me clearly? Okay, good. So first off, I'll start with a quick Om, and then we'll dive in. Om. So very, very grateful, first of all, to Vivekji, to Bhagwan for this opportunity to share with you all today, and for all of you for coming here, for the team for this opportunity. I'm very excited. I'd like to start with a quick question for you all. Could you post in the chat, how are you doing right now? It's really helpful for me to connect with you all better. Tired, happy, nervous, whatever it might be, all is well. It'll be helpful for me to just hear that from you. I'll look through the chat. Tranquil, content, grateful. Wonderful. Wonderful. Keep posting. I'm excited for the next half hour I have with you. And we'll be focusing on understanding mental health. We'll do a quick recap from the retreat. And we'll build on that a little bit. And then we'll have 10 minutes for small group discussion in a breakout room and some Q&A after that. So I want to start off with another question for you, which is the same question I started the retreat off with. So I'm going to look to the gallery right now. And could you all raise your hand if, generally speaking, other people would consider you as a loving person? Like, oh, yes, Rishi, Ardra, Simi, Mahima, they're loving people towards me. They're kind, helpful, nice. They're not mean all the time. Okay, I'm seeing all hands up. I'm expecting to see all hands up, which is expected, of our community, and everyone's here with a deeper purpose for their life. Now I'd like you to raise your hand if you consider yourself loving towards yourself. Do you love yourself? Raise your hand if that's true. Good. Great, great. So I really appreciate the honesty here. I am seeing hands, which I'm happy about, and I'm seeing considerably less hands. And this has been the case for me and is a changing process as well. And this is one of the themes that I wanted to highlight throughout our talk today about mental health. And the reason is that we're all here as a spiritual community, right? We're all here marching throughout our life towards Bhagavan. Vivekji powerfully shares the goal of this life is independent joy, to recognize the source of joy within ourselves and not need to depend on others, circumstances, etc., for happiness. To recognize that the divine, which is in everyone, is in our own hearts. And for me, when I hear that, I think that's loving ourselves. That's recognizing that the divine is literally in every atom of our being. And so when we talk about mental health and understanding mental health and mental illness, I think it's all part of the same journey. If we're able to love our bodies and take care of our physical health, if we're able to love our minds, our emotions, our identifications, and mental health, that will help us love ourselves to the depths, which is the purpose of this life, to recognize that to divinity. So that's kind of framing this talk in our spiritual context that we're all familiar with. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen real quick. Hope you can all see this. Okay, so I wanted to start off with some key takeaways from the retreat. I was hoping to maybe give a few kind of sutra forms, zip files as Vivekji shares, to summarize what we talked about in the understanding mental health part of the retreat. And then I'll build on it as I mentioned before. So the first part is, what is mental health? Most of us here, I think, are familiar with the Panchakosha framework that our human experience can be classified in terms of these 5 sheaths, which in some ways kind of cover up the divinity that we all are. So we understand physical health pretty easily, right? Physical health is the health of the Annamaya Kosha, or the outermost sheath, which is just another way of saying our bodies. When our body is healthy, when it's feeling well, it's able to function, able to help us perform our responsibilities and help us grow in our spiritual lives, we would say that's a healthy body. And it's the same thing with the mind. When we go deeper into the koshas, we learn about the manomaya kosha, our mind, our thoughts, our feelings, vijnanamaya kosha, also thoughts more focused on our decision making, our values, Anandamaya kosha, our ego, the different identities, identifications we have in life as a son or daughter or a professional or a friend. And all of these koshas encompass mental health. So if we're able to love these parts of ourselves and take care of them, take care of our emotions, take care of our thoughts and our different roles and responsibilities, and those aspects of ourselves are helping us function and fulfill our dharma, our responsibilities, mental health is there. And so everything we talk about in Chinmaya Mission, a lot of it is helping us maintain our mental health, our spiritual frameworks. Vivekji gave some wonderful insights in the retreat of thinking about mental health like we think about our eyes, where if anything, any dust particle comes near our eyes, we blink immediately as a reflex because we don't want to let anything that's dangerous inside our eyes. In the same way, we should do the same for our thoughts, for our emotions, be very intentional about what we let in ourselves. That's another way to take care of our mind, our feelings, the thoughts and ideas that we have. So a Vedantic definition of mental health. Next, we shifted in the retreat to talk about what is mental illness then? So if we identify mental health as this state where these various aspects of ourselves, which we're living in for most of the day, right? We're thinking about whatever thoughts are going through our minds. We're having feelings throughout every day, hopefully, if we're alive. And so if that's all functioning smoothly and we're able to fulfill our responsibilities, that's health. If that's not the case, we tend to classify that as illness when we're having emotions or thoughts that are disabling or distressing to the point where we're not able to function. Then it's typically in the realm of illness. It's not mental illness to have emotions. Emotions are healthy. It's normal for people to feel sad, angry, afraid in certain situations. Bhagavan has placed those emotions in us for particular reasons. But it's illness when it starts to disable us from functioning in our day-to-day. And so I put here a long word with a lot of hyphens that you'll see as a kind of zip file for understanding what causes mental illness, right? We might have asked ourselves that before. And so the word is biopsychosocio-spiritual causes of mental health. So we'll start with biological. There's biological drivers of mental health. Mental illness can run in families, such as major depressive disorder, or colloquially called depression, for example, or anxiety. So there's genes that we might be born with, different ways our brain might be developed or formed when we are born that increases the chance that we might have mental illness at some point in our life. So there's biological drivers. If people use any kind of substances, alcohol, marijuana, things like that, that could also change our biology, making it more likely for us to experience a mental illness. Okay, so that's the bio part. Psycho stands for psychological, the perspectives that we have about life, how we think about the world, how we think about ourselves, that impacts mental illness as well. If I have thoughts that are really demeaning towards others, towards myself, that's putting me at risk. If I have those thoughts day after day after day, that's putting me at risk for developing mental illness. Socio stands for social. So this is kind of common sense, right? The life experiences that we have with other human beings are another driver for mental health and mental illness. If someone goes through traumatic experiences in their life with other people in their life, that could increase the chance for mental illness. And finally, spiritual. So that's what we focus on in our community, our sense of meaning and purpose in life. Right? If people are lacking that, if I feel like my life is purposeless, if I'm just kind of living in autopilot day after day, that can also increase the risk for other forms of mental illness. So I'm quoting here underneath that a very powerful quote shared by Dr. Ryan Van Sickle, who is an emergency medicine doctor, another wonderful member of our community who spoke on mental health in the retreat as well. And he shared that separation from God is my depression. So he shared very powerfully his experience of clinical depression. He attributed that to his feeling that he was not connected to God. He didn't, that relationship wasn't there. He wasn't recognizing God in himself. And so I could classify that as a spiritual cause of depression. Okay. Following me so far? I hope this is not getting too technical, and please jot down questions as we chug along. And I should say that anytime mental health is being talked about, sometimes it can be difficult to hear. It might trigger experiences or memories from our own lives. So please take care of yourself. Don't hesitate to pause anytime during this conversation and take a break or get some water, whatever you need to take care of yourself. Okay. Okay. So I wanted to share a little bit about mental illness. I talked about this in the retreat, which is briefly going over from a psychiatric clinical standpoint, a medical standpoint, what are the types of mental illnesses that exist? That way we're just a little bit more familiar and can recognize them in ourselves or others if they were to come up. I should say that the point is not to become a diagnostician or a doctor, but at least to have some familiarity with the terminology and the experience of mental illness. So we have on the right Puja Gurudev's BMI chart, right? We're familiar with body is the perceiver of objects, mind feels thought, emotions, and intellect thinks thoughts. So I thought this is a framework that positions, in some ways, the Panchakosha with our divine nature above it. And this is another cool way, or a maybe accessible way we can understand mental illness. So I circle perceiver here. Disorders of perception. One example of that in the world of mental health and mental illness is schizophrenia. So when our body is functioning well, we can perceive sights and sounds and tastes and touches accurately. But when someone is born with an illness like schizophrenia that develops later in life, they have difficulty with perception. They might hear things that other people are not hearing, like hearing voices that can be quite frightening, or seeing things that other people are not seeing. There's no external stimuli. There's nothing in the room, but they're perceiving that. So that's an example of a disorder of perception or schizophrenia. If I circle the E for emotions, I'm classifying these as disorders of emotions. There's many types, and there's different terminology in mental health that we'll use to classify them, but I'm using this because I think it's intuitive. So these are experiences where the emotions that we are having are so intense that they're disabling. Again, that's how we classify something as a disorder. So major depressive disorder is not just feeling sad. Everyone feels sad at some point or another, but typically it comes and then it goes. It doesn't impact our daily functioning. We're still able to go to work. We're still able to do our duties at home, right? But major depressive disorder is where it's more and more intense. It's persistent. Typically, people can't experience a sense of joy in things they were previously finding joy in. It's also associated with low self-esteem and self-worth. And like many of these illnesses, in intense forms, it can trigger suicidal thoughts or thoughts of not wanting to be alive, for example. So that's when it gets very urgent where immediate medical assistance is needed. So that's where a disorder of emotions on the side of deep, deep sadness. Bipolar disorder has episodes of deep, deep sadness and also episodes of what's called mania. This is on the flip side where there's an intense experience of excitement. There might be even like a euphoria almost, but it gets to the point where that's disabling. Someone's no longer sleeping well because their mind is so active all night long. They're not sleeping. They're having so much energy. They're starting all these new projects. They're very active. It tends to be associated with impulsive and risky behaviors. So in other words, they're really not acting like themselves and tends to be very disruptive to the day-to-day life. So those are features of what's called bipolar disorder. And generalized anxiety is the emotion of fear when that becomes so intense that, yes, I was feeling a little nervous before this talk. That's normal. We're able to face it and navigate it. But when anxiety and fear gets to the point where it prevents us from even showing up, where we're avoiding responsibilities, not going to work, not showing up in social events because we're so afraid of what's going to happen, it becomes a disorder called generalized anxiety disorder. And the last one I'll highlight is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. After traumatic experiences, sometimes the effects linger where the body is in an almost constant state of fear, where it's on kind of high alert mode in order to protect itself. But as you could imagine, it becomes very disabling to function day after day like that. And lastly, I'll highlight disorders of behavior. So these are actions that people can do, that we do, that can get us into trouble and disable ourselves from functioning. So substance use disorder is when often people might self-medicate feelings of depression or anxiety with drugs like alcohol, marijuana. There's a whole list of drugs you probably are familiar, heroin, cocaine, for example, just to name a few. And it basically changes our brain functioning such that our brains become dependent on it and we need it to function. And then it becomes our whole life gets oriented towards needing that substance, and it can be very disabling. And lastly, I'll highlight briefly eating disorders. This is when also it could be related to different emotions or thoughts that people have about their body or body image. And if it feels like they're we might need a very, very unrealistic, unhealthy body image, say something that's extremely thin and underweight, people might start restricting the food that they eat unhealthily low amount of calories. Some people might even induce vomiting in order to retain a very low body weight. And on the flip side, there's also binge eating disorder where people eat out of control. Again, in some ways, it's self-medicating emotions that are challenging. The eating gets out of control, and it also becomes a disabling part of their life as well. So that's an eating disorder. So this is just a high-level summary of different domains of mental illness, so everyone's familiar with what these experiences might be like. All right, so moving on, we focused a little bit about what is mental health. We talked about what is mental illness, what drives it, and the different types of mental illnesses. And next, we highlighted in the retreat about mental health care because, again, for the sake of becoming familiar with what are the supports that are there for all of us to access. One perhaps perspective, or even I can call it a stigma that we might have in our culture is that, oh, a strong person is independent. We don't need to rely on others for support. So there might be a hesitance, especially for something like mental illness, where because it's the brain and mind affected, it impacts our thoughts, our feelings, rather than if I get a broken arm, of course, everyone's going to go to the doctor. But if I'm having these experiences where I'm disabled by my emotions or my thoughts, people might have the thought of, oh, if you seek help, then that's weak. We frame this as a way of depending on someone else to become independent. So that's a framing where it's resilient. It's a very resilient to recognize when we need help and seeking help during those times so we can pick ourselves back up and then keep going in our life. So it's a kind of a paradigm shift in a way. The main types of mental health care, briefly, psychotherapy, which is focused on talking, understanding emotions, understanding your thoughts, your identities, where the therapist serves as a mirror to kind of facilitate a kind of swadhyaya, a self-study with a trained professional who can facilitate that process of deeper self-understanding. That's psychotherapy. Psychiatry can often include that with the addition of medications, medicines that address the biological underpinnings of many of the mental illnesses that I mentioned. So those are, in kind of brief terms, mental health care and the resources that are available for us when we're going through these kind of challenges. And lastly, we wrapped up the retreat on understanding mental health with talking a little bit about how can we support our loved ones who are going through mental health challenges? What can we do that would actually be helpful for them? Well, first, we talked about leading ourselves, right? If we're struggling and we're not seeking help because, no, I don't need it, even though I'm trying different things, then how can we expect our loved one to lean on support, right? So first is leading by example. Second is compassionate presence. So compassionate presence, in a definition, I would say, is empathic reflection without solving. I'll say that one more time. Empathic reflection without solving. Empathic reflection means all of us have practiced empathy in our lives, right? That's why other people would characterize you all as caring. We can put ourselves in other people's shoes and wonder to ourselves, oh my gosh, they've been experiencing that kind of anxiety on the day-to-day. That sounds exhausting. That sounds really scary to live like that. Reflecting back that, oh, we can put ourselves in your shoes. We can try to understand and appreciate what is it that that person is going through, our loved one is going through, and simply reflect that back. But the key part is without solving, because often we want to help. So then we try to say, oh, you should do this. You should do that. Try this, try that. We have good intentions, but typically that lands not in a not helpful way, because when we ourselves have experienced unsolicited advice, it typically doesn't land. And especially when someone's going through a very vulnerable period of mental health challenges, what can be very helpful from family members is just that non-judgmental, compassionate presence, just the simple presence of someone who cares. And leave it to Bhagwan and them to walk their journey. We can encourage them to seek support at a pace that works for them to solve their challenges and what Bhagwan has put there for them, rather than try to fix it ourselves. All right. Okay, so before getting into this slide here, I wanted to discuss just a little bit about my own experience with mental health and mental health care, which I talked about in the retreat. I'll quickly summarize it and provide some context for this slide here. But before I do that, I want to encourage you all. I've talked about a good deal of different topics, so please check in with yourself, take a moment, ask yourself how you're feeling, how's your body doing. Take that into consideration and decide what you would like to do for yourself. If you want to take a pause, if you're good to keep going. I'd encourage you to just do a quick check-in, and I'll keep chugging along in the meantime. So I shared a little bit in the retreat about how when I started residency, I wore the hat of doctor for the first time, and it was a big responsibility to take on, and I was quite nervous. I would go to the hospital for my initial hospital shifts, and I felt quite worried about will I make a mistake? Would someone be impacted? And I was afraid of that. And I would notice it in my body, and then I would tell myself, nah, I shouldn't be feeling afraid. I should just keep moving on. And I'm a seeker. This is a seva. Let me just put myself out there. And I kept going and going, but that fear I had didn't go away. It was staying with me. And with time, it grew. I started to notice in my body, starting to have tremors when I got really afraid, started to know some chest tightness and difficulty breathing. And I kept telling myself, no, that's weak. I shouldn't be experiencing that. I shouldn't be feeling that way. I should just keep going. And it got to the point where the anxiety was so intense that I wasn't able to go to work on a particular day because I felt like I wouldn't be able to pay attention because my mind was not in a calm state. It was just racing. I was having panic. And so it was at that time where I realized that I needed help. I tried to do what I could, but it was still getting worse and worse. So that's when I started working with a therapist myself for the first time. And that was a very helpful experience. And I'm grateful to share that I'm feeling much better and I'm engaging with my work responsibilities and have a deeper understanding of myself and my emotions. But I want to put the context here of what was going on from a stigma perspective. I was having the stigma inside myself that emotions themselves are weakness. That as a spiritual seeker, a strong seeker is equanimous, is balanced. Whatever happens, whatever the circumstances, calm. And so I was having that as my goal, which is great. I think that's true. We all have that potential. But I was projecting that goal onto my present self. I wasn't meeting myself where I was at. So I was denying what I was going through. And so I came to reflect recently on Puja Gurudev's framework of suppression versus sublimation. And I wanted to really present this to you all because it was game changing for me. And I think it brings together a lot of really, really important concepts that counter the stigma that we often have in our communities that emotions themselves, like, oh, someone's emotional. We have a specific kind of stigma around that. Emotions themselves are weakness. And this is a counter to that. So Puja Gurudev has this framework of suppression versus sublimation of desires, right? We might have been familiar with this where um, in when we suppress our desires, we kind of brute force just ignore them rather than understanding them, versus sublimation is focused more on understanding where those desires come from, where we want to be, and letting them go intentionally and naturally. So I want to apply that here. And before I move on, I just also wanted to highlight, just to underline this in more ways, that if I could sum up the one most important lesson I've learned by becoming a psychotherapist and a psychiatrist myself through the training process over the last few years, what I've learned from that is that emotions are important. I've heard time and time again from some of my teachers that when we don't feel our emotions, when we don't understand them, that causes a lot of problems in our lives and a lot of pain. And so that is all kind of setting up the stage for this framework here. So here you see at the top the different emotions. Please raise your hand if you've seen Inside Out before. Great. Wonderful. Awesome. Cool. This is a great introduction into emotions and the important role that all of them have in our lives. And so here's several of our emotions, right? And we have two ways we can navigate them when we have an emotion coming up in our heart. First, suppression. Suppression is using Puja Gurudev's framework about suppression of desires into this framework on emotions. Suppression would be emotions are a weakness. It's I'm not focused on why I'm feeling afraid like I was. I'm focused on what I should be feeling. And so what I do is I use brute force and I just push my anxiety away. I deny it without understanding it. So if you can post in the chat, what do you think happens to our emotions when we suppress them? If you've noticed in your own lives, what happens to our emotions when we tend to suppress them? Any ideas? Explosion. They become stronger. Yes, they multiply. Exactly, exactly. And what I had here is they intensify, another word from what you're saying. Because one way for me to understand is Bhagavan has put them here for a reason. If we're ignoring them completely, they're gonna like become the elephant in the room, right? They're not a part of ourselves where we just compartmentalize and they just vanish all of a sudden. So they will intensify. And in my case, you heard in my story, the anxiety intensified, intensified, intensified until it became disabling, until I couldn't actually think clearly and go to work. The other pathway we can take, sublimation. So this is a very pivotal paradigm shift, which I have been internalizing over the last few years, which has been quite helpful for me, is that emotions are teachers. Now, when I experience emotions, I ask myself, Bhagwan has put this emotion here, whether it's sadness or anger or fear. What is this emotion trying to teach me about myself, about what I'm experiencing? And more often than not, there are insights that come up. It helps us understand our feelings. So I'll share a personal anecdote where through therapy, again, the therapist is kind of serving as a mirror. So they know that spirituality is important for me. So they're reflecting back what I'm sharing. They're asking me, how is my spirituality involved in all these experiences I'm having? And through that experience, I realized the fear I was having was not just, I was not afraid of messing up in the hospital. I was afraid because I had experiences in medical school where I didn't perform as well as I wanted to. And I had this vasana underlying that if I don't perform academically, if I don't perform professionally, then I am not good enough. My self-worth was identified with that. I didn't know that. I didn't know I even had that vasana. I thought, of course, yeah, we're all part of the same divinity. And yeah, I had that understanding theoretically, but I didn't know I had an underlying vasana that was driving my anxiety. So through the process of therapy and understanding my emotions, it helped me recognize there was a vasana. And then that gave me the power to change the vasana, right? Vivek often talks of shifting from anatma to atma vasana, of recognizing, no, my self-worth shouldn't be dependent on my academics. Devi, God is inside me. Regardless of if I make a mistake, I can learn from it. God is in all of us. So it helped me more intentionally embody the truth and recognize the vasana I had. So what do you think happens to emotions when we understand them, when we process them, when we learn from them as our teachers? If you can post in the chat. If you can recollect a time where you had a feeling and you didn't push it away, you sat with it, you made space for it, you asked, okay, what is this coming from? They dissolve, they melt away, they become manageable. We feel free. Yes, very powerful words. And the word I use is transcendent. So, again, putting this back where we started with the spiritual journey, in order for us to recognize who we are deeper than our emotions, deeper than our thoughts, deeper than our vasanas, we have to transcend those aspects of ourselves. And if we keep suppressing these aspects of ourselves, I can speak from first person, if I keep suppressing those aspects of myself, that sheath is going to become so thick, we're not going to see the divinity that's underlying all of that. So I'm even framing this as a spiritual practice, not just as this is a way to kind of work with our emotions and to be like, very professionally effective. That's true. But I think this is also a way for us to advance in our spiritual life because this will allow us to move beyond and deeper than our manomaya kosha and really feel who we are, what we are deeper than that. So that was the main takeaway from building on the parts of the retreat, which I summarized earlier, that shifting from emotions as weakness to emotions as teachers. So with that, I'll pass it back to the team for our breakout room.
Thank you so much, Vignesh. That was amazing. Just you made everything so simple to understand. When it comes to mental health, it's a lot, and it can be very complicated. So thank you for simplifying that and also bringing in your personal story. It really means a lot to us. So thank you so much. And the discussion topic, I'm going to put it in the chat as well. It is, what are specific examples in your life you suppress emotions, and what is a specific practice you can use to shift to sublimation? Great breakout session and a good discussion. now we're going to take a few minutes. I want to introduce Prakash. He was at our retreat, at Facing Stigmas retreat, and he is just going to give his viewpoint and his what he learned from the retreat with us. So with that, and he's from Arlington, Virginia. So I'll hand it over to Prakash.
Thank you, Deepal. Hari Om, everyone. So yeah, I was at the retreat a couple of weekends ago. I think I recognize a lot of faces from there, so it's good to see everyone and a few not there. So just a brief introduction for the folks that weren't there. So how it was kind of structured was there was a lot of workshops, and they were kind of run by different, people, including one by Vignesh, who just kind of gave something similar earlier. So my biggest takeaway, I would say a lot of the separate workshops kind of connected. So I'll just give a few kind of examples. So for the first workshop, we had to kind of write down what we thought our different identities were, and at one point, and then we had to also go into kind of and write down where some of these identities kind of conflicted. And generally, for me personally, I'm also one of those people that just kind of keeps everything inside and kind of, not necessarily bottles everything up, but some deep thoughts I just kind of keep inside, and I don't really put them out there anywhere. So kind of writing that down, even though, I've heard a lot that writing your thoughts on paper helps a lot, just writing it down on like those Post-its was much less overwhelming and much easier. So it kind of just helped me kind of simplify whatever was in my head and put it down into different sections. And the good thing was, after we wrote those down, we had to kind of paste them on the walls, and we got to see what everyone wrote, even anonymously. And it was kind of comforting to see that a lot of the things, anxieties I had, about how some of these, for example, like my identity as a son and my identity at work, like how they conflict, things like that, and causes problems, was, kind of similar to what others were going through. And then later on in some of the other sessions, we were kind of able to open up to our discussion groups, and we had to go into like even smaller groups and speak to, people sitting right next to us, things like that. And it just felt very easy to speak to everyone there, because since we had already gone through like those exercises of kind of putting what we had inside out. And it just helped me be much more vulnerable. So in a nutshell, I think for me, my biggest takeaway was, try just being more vulnerable with some things rather than just, like handling things internally alone. So it doesn't necessarily have to be with someone like a loved one necessarily. It can even be with someone professional, kind of how what Vignesh kind of talked about. And I've just noticed that, like, even ever since that retreat, I've been trying to kind of express that more with, my close people, and it's actually helped. It just reduces, the stress, I guess, I go through, and yeah, overall, it's been a positive impact on my mental health. So, yeah, how are you? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Prakash, for sharing. And thank you, Vignesh. So we have about 10 minutes left, so we're going to transition to Q&A.
Hari Om, Sudarshan.
Hi, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
All right. So the last few weeks, I've just been feeling a lot of like tiredness. And when there's tiredness, it's not easy to identify. It's sometimes not easy to identify if it's physical tiredness that's like spreading over to the mind, or it's mental tiredness that's spreading over to the body. Because that determines like what your primary focus should be. Like especially if it's like springtime and allergies, you may think, oh, it's a physical, like you're physically sick, and so like you'll go entirely into like taking all the rest you can, like you need or want mode. But if you really feel like it's mental, then you'll step up your discipline and feel like a quieter mind is going to help my body. So I guess with trying to step up discipline, and that's leading to a lot more tiredness. how do I know how much self-love and self-discipline to give when it's not clear where the tiredness?
The one thought that's coming to mind is the importance of meeting yourself where you are. Because I think this is a very nuanced balance that you're trying to strike of when is it important to kind of nurture more discipline. And by discipline, I take it to kind of more like relating to your sadhana as like having more contemplation time or waking up earlier and having your contemplation time or something along those lines. So yeah, it could be a very delicate balance. I often hear Vivekji share that um, it's both the self-compassion and then the self-discipline that are both kind of important to have, because if we lean too much on either side of that spectrum, then we're not going to be learning and growing from that experience. So, and I think that I could also frame it as all of it really is self-compassion, because when you think about from moment to moment about like what does it look like to meet yourself where you are, I would think about, where are you at with your body and where are you at with your mind? So, for example, for me, if I'm noticing that sometimes I get migraines, and it can be very difficult to know because sometimes it's psychologically stress induced, and sometimes it's because I didn't get enough sleep, and that triggers it. And sometimes if I don't know what it is, I'll just pay attention to my body and I'll see what my intervention is doing to affect my body. So if I'm having more quiet time and contemplation and I'm really trying to identify, am I stressed out today? What am I feeling? Oh, there are emotions that I've kind of tucked away and I'm acknowledging them. If I'm feeling better and more relieved, then that's kind of like a check mark for me that yes, I'm addressing the cause. But if I'm doing that and still that headache is there and it's persisting and persisting, then it might clue me into like maybe I've been exerting a lot more and I just need to take a nap and take some rest. So I would say from my perspective and experience, it would be more like a minute to minute focusing on is your body? What have your interventions done to affect your body? And what does your body need in that moment? And sometimes loving ourselves means being disciplined with ourselves in some way. If I'm having all these emotions and they're stressing me out, um, or I'm getting stressed by them, if I say, oh, let me just take a nap, that's actually not going to help those emotions. And sometimes nurturing more discipline in the sense of like, let me journal about it. Let me have some quiet time. Let me sit in front of the altar. That's a way of loving ourselves too. So kind of like moment to moment, just check in with yourself and your body and your thoughts.
Hariom, we have many questions coming in through the anonymous link, so please keep them coming. I'm gonna read one of them to start, but we'll try to answer all of them. And Vignesh has kindly agreed to stay a little bit later as well. This first question, what would you recommend to someone who is guarded to become more open emotionally? Hariom.
So I think the my approach might differ based on who it is. So for example, if it's the questioner who is feeling guarded and wants to become more open, my approach would be different if the questioner is thinking about their friend or family member or something like that. So I'll briefly touch on both. So if it's the questioner and you yourself are feeling quite guarded about having emotions or expressing emotions, um, I think that taking time to ponder on your own emotions individually first will be helpful. And the reason I say that is I'm curious about why are you guarded? Why is this individual, let's say myself, why am I guarded? And based on that reason, I would address it. So for example, if I'm feeling guarded, I don't want to share emotions with someone because I'm worried that they will judge me. That's a valid concern. So I would be very intentional about who we're opening up to. Is this someone who is non-judgmental? Is this someone that will support us unconditionally? And then go from there. Is it because I have my own thought about If I share my emotions, that says I'm weak, that says that I'm not a strong seeker, then ponder on what we talked about today about we have those stigmas in our own self, and we need to address that in ourselves and really recognize that emotions are teachers and are sources of strength as opposed to sources of weakness. And that might give us the confidence to push ourselves a little bit out of our comfort zone. Like Prakash was mentioning, which he did a wonderful job sharing so authentically, that could push us out of our comfort zone and start the process, and it becomes much easier. And very quickly, if it's a friend, I would suggest just being that non-judgmental, compassionate presence. We can never force someone to share with us, but if they know time and again, you're just there for them, you're a listening ear. If they want to talk, you listen. If they don't want to talk, you don't push, but you're just there for them. I think that will naturally encourage people to be more open. And when you self-disclose to other people and you yourself are vulnerable, that encourages others to be vulnerable as well.
Thank you for that. Another question we have here, how can we not feel upset by the negative emotions we feel? For example, disliking oneself for feeling sad.
Yes, yeah, that's a very important question. And I think it relates a lot to what I was sharing in my own story. I was kind of disliking myself because I was afraid. And I think for me, it was my own, that stigma I had was that emotion is a sign of weakness. If I'm not equanimous, then I'm weak, which is not true. Uh, I think with our spiritual practice, we can get to that point where we're in balance with our emotions and we're in touch with them, but I can't imagine that I'm there already. So with regards to when we kind of shame ourselves for having emotions, I think it's important to really look at that and ask ourselves in Mananam, in Swadhyaya, in our journaling, why am I doing this? If my friend was expressing sadness, would I say the same to them? Why am I treating myself in that way? And again, pondering on what we talked about today, um, reflecting on this ideal that everything that's in our body and mind, Bhagavan is put there, right? Why has Bhagavan give this emotion? Is it just to make me feel ashamed of myself? Or is it to teach me something? And the more and more we wrestle with these topics for ourselves, you'll make it your own. And then you can start to be more open with yourself about your emotions without feeling like it's a bad thing to have emotions. And I also hesitate of using negative for emotions as well, because I think they all serve their roles.
Hariom, if you want to stick around to get some of your questions answered, we'll be continuing. Thank you for everyone who is here. Our next question is an interesting one. Living in a generation where we grew up learning about the importance of mental health, we may understand the benefits of checking in with ourselves and leaning into our emotions. How do we educate our parents about acknowledging their emotions and positive mental health habits?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a good question. All the questions are good questions. So what comes to mind first is we should lead by example. So, if our parents are not recognizing or seeing how we navigate the different emotions in our own lives or how we relate to our emotions, then they're unlikely to question what it is that the process that they have grown up with. And so I think leading by example is very important. If a parent is observing their child and they see that they're exploring and getting support, or they're journaling and they're working through their emotions and asking what their emotions are telling them, that parent might be more likely to be open-minded to that. The second thing I would share is also the compassionate presence bit in kind of a different way, but I think the same idea, where we can never change anyone. We can't fix anyone's problem, or just as we have grown up with certain patterns of thinking is very difficult to change. So understanding that. So if we are that non-judgmental source of support for our parents, and if they feel like we can listen to them and kind of validate what they might be feeling and provide that compassionate presence, they might be more open to having these kind of dialogues with us. Because I think if we just come off straight away saying, hey, this is what I'm doing, it's kind of better than what you're doing. I know you're not saying that, but it can come off that way, then people will naturally be more guarded. But if we can be that non-judgmental presence, and if a parent is open to talking about emotions with us, we can offer a suggestion of speaking from your own perspective of, this is something that I've been working on, and I found that when I'm not really listening to my emotions, it really kind of blows up. But when I'm able to talk about it, it helps a lot, um, and just share that with them without pushing. And if they're open and they're ready to hear that at that moment, then great. If it's not, then maybe it's not the right time for them, and they'll Bhagwan is guiding everyone. So I think those are the thoughts I have for that one.
Thank you for that answer. That meant a lot. This next question is, how can we not feel upset by the negative emotions we feel? Or sorry, no, we did that one. I'm getting sorry. There's so many coming in. My inbox is getting refreshed. Yeah, here we go. What are some tips on not giving in to negative emotions like anger?
So this is another good question, and I'll start off with a perspective from the Panchakosha framework. And it's the idea that emotions are one aspect of our experience. When we identify with them, they control and they take over. When rather than I'm experiencing anger, I am angry, for example, then it becomes much more difficult to navigate. So when we're able to witness and be that sakshi and witness and understand, I'm experiencing anger and explore it further, we will be able to navigate it with more intentionality. So that's one response. The second response is, I'll challenge you a little bit. I don't think anger is a negative emotion. I don't think any of the emotions are negative, so long as they help us learn about what's going on in our heart and in others. So in psychotherapy, we're trained to understand the role of every emotion. Anger has a purpose. The role of anger is to protect. If someone kind of threatens my kid or threatens me in some way and I don't feel angry, then I'll be like, I won't do anything. And that's dangerous, right? Just like that, fear has its own purpose. It also rises to make sure we're cautious when things are kind of uncertain. So we should first, I think, before labeling the emotion as negative or positive, to explore, okay, the same idea. Bhagwan has put this emotion here. What is Bhagwan trying to teach me from this anger? And explore it first before thinking about how to manage it, because that's what I was doing in my example. I wasn't exploring my fear. I was trying to manage it immediately without understanding where it was coming from. So if we're able to understand the anger, what's driving it, what's making me angry, what's making me feel threatened, that can help me understand how to respond. And sometimes, like for myself, if we understand by exploring that anger is driven by a vasana, maybe I'm attached to a particular expectation of my wife or my family, and that's what's making me angry, then I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I have that expectation. Then I can ask, is that true? Is this a realistic expectation? Is this healthy? If it's not aligned with my values, then I can choose, okay, I'm going to shift this expectation. But we can't do that hard swadhyaya and introspection until we understand where the anger is coming from.
Thank you for that. This next question is I think related to how people are feeling when discussing this topic in our community. The concept of mental health and seeking support in South Asian families is seen as bringing dishonor. What are the cultural and historical roots behind this belief in South Asian families, and how can we begin to shift these mindsets toward greater acceptance and understanding of mental health?
Yeah, I think this is an important question, and it's very relevant to some of the other questions asked earlier. So I'll try to synthesize the reflections that come to mind. I'm not an expert from a historical perspective, so I would encourage any community member who does have that history to share in the chat. uh, from a historical perspective. From a cultural perspective, my best guess is that it has to do with this idea that emotion is weakness, that asking for help with emotions is weakness. Whether that could be from the perspective of a spiritual lens, where perhaps, like I was experiencing, where if what's idealized as what we're all capable of is feeling very balanced and equanimous, and I'm not there, then I might portray that I am feeling very weak. Um, and and also, sometimes it can have to do with what is it that we are prioritizing in our culture. And, Vivekji has often drawn this very powerful comparison of, do we prioritize achievement or do we prioritize happiness? And many parents feel like they're raising kids to prioritize happiness, but when Vivekji has asked the kids, raise your hand, which you're learning is most important, most of the kids raise their hand as it's achievement. And so these are different ideas, different strands of what is it we're prioritizing? What are we framing as strength and good? And when that's not aligned with emotions, then emotions and seeking help for emotions is portrayed as the opposite of that, right? As weakness, as, not competitive or valuable. And um, and my response would be the same as what I shared before. In order to shift, we first have to start with ourselves and lead by example, and that will start to influence our own circles as well. And shifting from this paradigm of emotions as weakness to emotions are teachers. Those are just some initial thoughts.
We have about, looks like 4 more questions in our list. Maybe we'll try to do one more, and then we'll try to address the other few in a subsequent workshop. So if your question's not answered, we will keep it safe and make sure it's addressed at a forthcoming workshop. This question is how can we learn to hold space for emotions, especially uncomfortable ones, or the ones we thought we'd already dealt with? And what tools or practices can help us process them with more compassion and understanding?
Yeah, I think that this question is similar to what we talked before, in the sense of holding space is first paying attention to it. If we're not paying attention to our bodies and our minds and our emotions, which are all, intertwined, then we're not going to be able to hold space. And in addition to what I shared before, this pivoting our paradigm shift to emotions are teachers, that will help us create space because we recognize this is important, not just for our health, but for the health of our loved ones, for our own spiritual growth. And there's so many other wonderful, I think, frameworks that we have in our community already that we can really rely on. For example, um, Vivekji often encourages us to write regularly, whether that's journaling or reflecting on something we've read. The same thing about reflecting on our days and our emotions. That's an opportunity when we're writing in our journal for a few minutes every day to check in with, what am I feeling today? What are the feelings that are lingering with me as I reflect on the day that just went by? And Pujya Gurudev shares this in different terminology: introspection, detection, etc., etc. It's part of the same framework where when we look in, we're able to hold space and work with what we're feeling and understand ourselves better.
Hariom, thank you so much, Vignesh, for your wisdom and guidance and just your vulnerability. I think the fact that so many of us are here, just staying late to hear you share, it means so much having you in our community. So deep gratitude.
I shared before, I think I'm the chief beneficiary of these experiences, so I'm grateful to everyone for this opportunity. I learned a lot.
Wonderful. with that, we'll just close with 3 Shantis, and then we will see you next month, third Sunday of the month. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Be well.